Welcome to the Connected Teamwork podcast by Growth Leaders Network. How do we learn to truly thrive together? How do we stay connected to our authentic selves, each other, and our purpose as a team, especially when challenged? How do we unlock the deeper levels of group intelligence? Enjoy this episode of the Connected Teamwork podcast and learn practical tools to evolve the connectedness of your team to its next level.
Well, and welcome to the Connected Teamwork podcast, episode 54, where we help leaders and teams connect more deeply to their innate potential and each other thriving together. I'm here together with Hansen Hossein today. Hansen, how are you today?
It's nice to see you, Hilke. I'm doing very well, thanks. 54 episodes, quite amazing.
It's an amazing journey. We do Connected Teamwork podcast to help leaders and teams figure out how do we stay connected also when we don't feel it, like when we're in conflict, when things are not working well, when we feel irritated. And of course, also how do we can we build on the inspiration, the creativity, the great ideas that we can build together. That's what this podcast is about. And Hansen Hossein comes with us with an amazing background. I'm actually quite humbled to speak with Hansen today. He's an Emmy Award-winning journalist, strategic communication advisor, and leadership expert with over 2 decades of experience in navigating turbulent and transformative times. He's the founder of HRH Media Group. He has a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University and other universities like McGill and the Paris Panthéon-Assas University. He has reported for NBC in war zones of the Balkans and the Middle East. He earned an Emmy and the Overseas Press Club Awards. His experience has helped him to uncover and convey compelling narratives that a skill he now leverages to help organizations communicate effectively during times of crisis and change. He does so many other things. He leads the Communication Leadership Program, or he's a director there at the University of Washington. He works with various organizations, and he's a passionate content creator and a speaker and mentor, and a person that dives into the complexities of this world in a myriad of ways, one of which I think was related to doing something related to MLK on the East Coast, which I want to hear more about. It's a great honor. Hansen strikes me as a person who's so super thoughtful, very rich, and so much that has gone into his eyes of seeing the world the way he does. Hansen, tell us about what you've learned about connectedness in leadership and teams in your life and leadership.
Well, I really like the way, Hilke, that you even preface this conversation talking about creativity and making that connection. For me, creativity is fundamentally what drives me, and I understand it's taken me a very long time to understand that creativity comes from connecting to something that's well beyond just us, our individuality. That ultimately, I now understand it to mean about it's alignment. It's alignment with what you can say God or the universe or whatever else, but finding that alignment, that's what I've been trying to do for the last 2 or 3 decades. And even as you were recounting my bio, I have to correct you a little bit because it speaks a bit to the way I see the world. That I used to be director of that graduate program at the University of Washington. I was very aligned with the university at the time that I created it because I was trying to think about how storytelling was going to really be front and central for professionals as digital media began to take hold, and how we could connect differently through storytelling. I don't do it anymore because one of the reasons I have had such an interesting, eclectic, eccentric background is that I need to stay connected professionally to things that matter to me, to that zeitgeist, to how the universe resonates, so I can be creative. And when I no longer feel like it is feeding that creativity, I have to stop doing it. And so the last thing I'll say about my background is about actually it's now almost 10 years ago, I gave a TEDx talk and it was called Why I Dropped the Mic. And it's about stopping to do things even at the height of it when it matters to you,
Mm.
because you know that you have to move on, because you have to stay connected and find that creativity and that wellspring that comes from something well beyond us.
I had to drop the mic. That is such a powerful concept where the universe and the zeitgeist meet. So tell us a bit more about how do you tap into what's called from you? How does that work for you? What is your process, or do you have a process, or how does that
It's
work?
you would think that it sounds very visceral, right? That it's oh, this same thing's like the cool thing to do right now, but it's ultimately the thing that I just cannot get out of my head. It's a story or an idea that says, "Hey, come knock on this door." And even if you walk away from that door, the door is still there and the knock is still happening, and it won't leave you alone. And so, and I know that when that's happening, and that's what's driving me, and it's beyond anything that says it's going to pay you or what other people care about, that it's worth pursuing. And that's why I have 3 law degrees, but I ended up becoming a journalist. It's why I ended up in the Middle East covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because I just felt like I had to see that firsthand. It's why I left that job, even at the height of my career with all those accolades, because I felt like something was changing, that people were telling stories differently, and I didn't want to be doing what they were doing in television news anymore. It was a very lonely road for a few years trying to figure that out. But that's what led me to doing what I do now, because I was trying to understand something that really was meaningful to me. And I think
Mm,
that's ultimately it, Tilka, that if I can't find meaning in something, I can't do it. And so I have to continue to
mm.
drive towards that meaning, because that's what drives me, and then it makes me much more effective and thoughtful. And if I can share that with others along the way, even better.
If I can't find meaning, I can't do it. I think that's such a beautiful guidepost for all of us to think about. So tell us a little bit about what you've been called to do in this moment, June 2024. What is pulling you in?
Well, I really appreciate that we're having a conversation that I know that people might listen to in the future, but we're speaking of the moment now. And I really like that, because typically when we do these kind of things, you want to keep it as evergreen as possible. But we're gonna talk about the moment. And just before this conversation that we are having now, I was in another conversation that I think is worth sharing with a woman who was 14 years old back in 1965, when she was walked across a bridge in Selma, Alabama, to fight for voting rights for her people, who were not didn't have access to American democracy despite the promise of that. And so she and I had this incredible conversation. And what struck me is that, she walked with Martin Luther King. She was beaten on that bridge by people who did not want her to have that right that we should all have as American citizens. And she's told this story so many times, to many people around the world, to media, but she's still in this conversation with me as we were trying to record this, because we're going to put this recording outside the building next to that bridge. So people, when they visit, will hear her as an eyewitness statement on Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama. She still got emotional. She still cried, 60 years after the fact. And I know that she's not performing. I know that she's still suffering from what she went through. I know that she's still processing. I also know that she recognizes how powerful the act was that she helped accomplish, that changed the world, that
Mm.
gave people access to that. And I just found that I was utterly inspired, but also humbled by this person having that emotion with me.
Mm. Mm. So that is part of what you're working on right now, it sounds like.
That's right.
And
Sorry. Go ahead. Hilke, ask that question.
no, that's part of what you're working on right now to help bring that experience into the people's minds in a maybe different way. Maybe, but I could ask you lots about that. But what I want to know a little bit more about how Hansen works. So tell us about how did you get in touch with that experience? What guided you there to that bridge in Selma?
Well, generally speaking, I think this is fairly universal to my journey, professional journey. Is I don't like telling stories that other people have told. I also find it very dull to hear the same vocabulary and language used over and over again, especially on places like LinkedIn, where you can tell almost like an artificial intelligence has shared that output. I tell my kids, don't be boring, be imaginative and creative and original.
Mhm.
And so with the story of Selma, which many people may or may know because it's so historic,
Mhm.
my concern about this was that we've been telling that story for a very long time, but I'm worried that it's losing its resonance, especially during this period of American democracy, and that younger generations they don't quite get it.
Mm.
And so, as a storyteller, as somebody who always wants to be on the front lines of things as they're happening, it felt to me that this was an old story that was losing its gravitas, and I was worried
Mhm.
about that. And so, the people who are involved here in the Pacific Northwest with supporting the veterans of the Voting Rights March of 1965 in Selma asked me to bring my perspective and my facility with technology to say, what can we do to help these people continue to reach other generations around the world? Selma's not very easy to get to, and so I agreed to be part of that group to help them sort of say, okay, your story is powerful. We don't want you to say it any differently. We're just going to find
Mhm.
new modalities so that people can connect to it even more powerfully in a
Mhm.
way that it resonates, and it doesn't matter what generation you're from. To many people, what happened in Minnesota with George Floyd might be more resonant than what happened in 1965 on that bridge in Selma. And so my role is to help connect the dots on that, but also think about more ways to bring it through the vehicle of digital technology.
Very clear, very clear. So I'm curious about, how do you maintain interest? Because I think many people have this like, oh, that's exciting. And then it becomes time for the hard work. How do you stay interested?
Intellectual curiosity is ultimately what fuels me. I want to learn. And if I'm not learning because I'm repeating something in a rote way because I just mastered it, there's something wrong. And so in this situation, first of all, I'm going to a part of the world that I've really always wanted to spend some time in, but never really had the chance. So I'm given this privileged connection to these people who have
Mm.
changed the world and changed history in a
Mm.
part of the world that is frankly almost diametrically opposite to where I am right now in the Seattle area. So I love that. That drives me. I have a unique challenge before me in terms of trying to figure out how to make this story resonate. And the other privilege is that this is an epic narrative. This is
Mhm.
like Exodus in the Bible,
Right.
and the people who hold the keys to this narrative are entrusting me to help them figure out how to keep it
Mhm.
going. And
Mm.
that is a massive responsibility. And I also want to make sure that I do not mess it up. And so that drives
Mm.
me. This is not an easy thing. Success is not assured. And I like the challenge. I like the learning, and I like the trust that's involved with it.
There's so much there. I keep learning. I feel the responsibility to honor what's being given to me. And going back to where you started us off, which was like, I'm going to have to be where the universe meets what's the zeitgeist. So we're going to take a short break in a moment. I'm very curious to hear more, uh, Hassan, about like Hansen, about how do you read the zeitgeist of today, and how does it inform your own leadership? Like, how does that work? Because I think that's a struggle, or maybe even quandary or question that many of us are in. Like, given everything that's going on, how do you keep finding your path and maybe not like find what's yours to do, what's your story to tell? How do you frame it at the level that is right, relevant? You know?
Well, I have a good answer for you once we come back from the break.
Let's take a break. Let's take a break. We've been listening to Hansen Hossain, an Emmy Award winning journalist, master storyteller, on the edge, always, it seems like, on the edge. I'm your host, Hoko Faber. See you after the break.
You are listening to the Connected Teamwork podcast by Growth Leaders Network. Do you want to learn more about building the next level of connectedness in your team? Please contact Growth Leaders Network on LinkedIn. And now, back to the show.
You're listening to the Connected Teamwork Podcast, episode 54. I'm your host, Hilke Farb. I'm here with Hansen Hossein. And one of the things that struck me was this has to have meaning, otherwise I can't do it. And I'm thinking about the repercussion and the learnings for that for anybody working on a team. Like, how does this, what I'm doing, create meaning? Is this meaningful to me? And if it's not, can I give it meaning? Have I forgotten the meaning? Or is this meaning no longer aligned with me, which maybe then begs for a different choice for me? Question, Hansen. Think about this zeitgeist that we're in. How do you tell the story that's yours?
Well, I'm going to give you a very simple answer to that question, but I want to come back to, I think, what is the premise to your podcast. And I've been dancing around your question around teams and teamwork and this. And one of the reasons is that I don't like to use the word team in professionals. I find, I mentioned earlier that I'm not a big fan of usual suspects in terms of language or stories. And I find that team is overused in business settings, and I don't know really what it means. And I don't like sports metaphors generally, because I think it sort of belittles really what's happening. What I in fact, when I had my own team at the university, they knew how much I disliked that word, so we ended up with something like fellowship or something like that. Okay. But ultimately,
all right.
And I don't need to change things here for you for the equation, but I think ultimately, I'm always looking to find what motivates others so that we can speak to their motivation in that group, that fellowship, that team, and that they feel like they've got both agency and maybe recourse as we're trying to figure something out together. And so to get back to your question now from the break is that how do we do that? You used a word before the break, which I think really speaks to my methodology, which is about the edge. You have to be on the edge whether you're in a team situation or reporting in a war zone, to truly understand what's coming that you can't normally see. Because typically when we're in a comfortable situation, we have a vested interest in the status quo. We sort of say, I like the way things are normally. That's the rules of the game. This is reward. This is risk. I'm going to figure it out, and it's going to be quite easy. And one of my favorite recent authors is Yuval Harari, who's written a great bunch of books. He's a historian in Israel and Jerusalem. And he said something really meaningful. He says, you cannot truly understand what is happening if you're too close to power in the middle of things. As a leader, you have to exist on the periphery as much as possible without a vested interest in the outcome of change, so you can see change when it's coming from an unexpected direction. And I think early on, I was in my 20s when I was reporting on the Middle East and the Balkans. That's the periphery. And you begin to see that you see the change happening much quicker there, but it seems like it's too far away to affect the status quo, but it's coming. And now we're living in this period that is totally about transformation and historic change. And maybe we're all being affected. So it doesn't matter whether you're on the periphery or in the middle. But to me, to be connected, to lead, to work with a team is always about, whether it's a fiction or it's temporary, of giving up power for at least a while so I can see more clearly about what's coming and what others may want out of a situation that could make it a much more fruitful transaction, collaboration, relationship.
Very striking. So I need to give up power for a while, at least, to be able to stand on the periphery. And I can see that as an orientation, like at a very macro scale and also very at the micro scale in our lives. So can you tell us a bit about how you practice that principle, maybe also in your life? Like how do you practice it in your life?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, this is why I gave that talk about why I dropped the mic, is because if I'm in a professional situation where I begin to resent it or take it for granted, it's because I'm in too comfortable and too powerful of a situation. And that's where I begin to not to actually be good at what I do anymore. And so I really realized at that point that I've got to extricate myself from that situation of comfort and power and start all over again so I can learn, so I can, find new stories, so I can be meaningful and be of service to other people and find new ways for them to trust me. And it puts me into a situation of humility, but through that humility, I can give more because I'm ready to understand what's going on in a new situation as opposed to just going over the same thing over and over again. I mean, there are people who've written about this who, from a business point of view, like I think it's Clayton Christensen, um, which is the innovator's dilemma. Like if you're a company like Microsoft or Apple and you've got one invention that you just keep making a lot of money from, and you don't see the thing coming from the other direction, like the internet or virtual reality or artificial intelligence, then that's a problem. And so I think it behooves us to always find a way to pull ourselves out of that powerful situation so we can see that.
I love it. I can see stepping out on the periphery for a while is quite a brave step, because you have to let go of that comfy, powerful situation. So tell us a little bit about how you work with yourself to make that transition, like to step out of the power, out of the comfort. How do you drop your mic?
It's first recognizing that emotion of either boredom or resentment of the situation, and say, or could be satisfaction. Job well done. You're not going to get any better than that. And the people who have come along with you for the ride, you've served them well, but there's a point where you've crossed over a curve or a mountaintop, and maybe it's not serving them so well anymore. So, for example, this graduate program, the communication leadership program that I created and I led for so long, I knew at a certain point that because of my lack of energy or interest or lack of creativity, at a certain point, I would not be serving my community well anymore by sticking around and leading it. Somebody else had to come in with fresh perspective, even if it meant that they dismantled the whole thing and did it completely in their vision and image. Because that served the zeitgeist at that point. To me, that's what has to happen. And you're right, it does take courage, stupidity, I don't know, and it's very risky to keep starting over again, especially because there is ageism, particularly in our part of the world and in our industries, tech. But I believe I come at it with a perspective of abundance, so that this is always what the world or the universe has expected of me to do. And to not to do it is actually the wrong thing. that something else will come my way because I have forced myself to reinvent what I'm doing.
So what do you do in the empty moments in between? Because I can imagine that, for example, with the University of Washington, you're in this program and then you end it. And is it then floop? There's Selma, or how does that?
That is such a great question. And you're absolutely right. There are empty moments, and they're discouraging moments. And sometimes, and I'm not talking about weeks, it could be years before you strike the vein of alignment again, right? And to me, that means you have to be practicing and learning and reaching out. And so I'm a musician as well. I got my studio, the guitars and everything like that. I want to always engage in some kind of creative act, whether or not it ever sees the light of day that the public will engage with. It's really important that I remain in a mindset of creativity. Because that allows me to sort of practice that. And so when something does come along like Selma, which I did not expect to come along, I'm at least prepared to take it on with the right mindset, as well as maybe some new skills that I would not have otherwise had. So I take advantage of that time to do that. And what's amazing to me is that I spoke about abundance, and it sounds very woo-woo, but even when I stop doing something, there is something that comes along, even if it's interim, like a client like Microsoft or whatever else, that will at least help me put food on the table and keep me in the vein of doing work and still seeing things new. And so it seems to work for me. I wouldn't necessarily recommend to everybody, but it works.
I'm very struck by staying in the vein of creativity and finding ways to make sure we we stay connected that way? And you used, some pretty big words like universe, God, what's expected of me, zeitgeist. What else do you do to stay connected? What do you do?
I want to clarify, I'm not a religious person at all. I'm very attracted to sacred stories, whether it's Judaism, Islam, Christianity, or Selma. Those are sacred stories. The founding of America is a sacred story. And I love the fact that motivates people to do really powerful things. But I do believe that the creation of the world that we live in, one way or the other, was an act of creativity. And so if we are living within the benefits of that act of creativity, I think it behooves us to continue to create. That's the alignment, right? And so the thing that really, one of the things I do, which is ridiculous, is that I bike almost everywhere I can. Bicycling to me is the epitome of what I've been talking about. It puts you into a state of vulnerability, of powerlessness, but of an eyewitness role on the edge where you could die at any minute because you're vulnerable. But it allows me to see and exercise and think differently without any sense of entitlement or expectation. When you're driving, that's power. And that's anger and it's fear, and it's all rolled up into that massive resource that you're using. When you're biking, it's self-propelled, and it just allows you to think and see and do differently. So that's what I do. I bike a lot.
Biking on the edge. Coming from the Netherlands, I can't help, we are a biking country. That's how we grew up.
That's paradise to me.
I love it. We're coming towards the end of our conversation already. Tell us maybe, what would you say to a person who just is not feeling connected to this vein of creativity at the moment? What would you say to them?
I do this a lot with my former students when they come to me, because they know that they want to do something different, but they're afraid to take that first step. So I usually just try to get them to voice the thing that they're afraid to say out loud. And then basically I say, I'm the person who's going to counsel you to take the most extreme of all the options you've mentioned to me, because I think you owe it to yourself. Otherwise, you'll never get it out of your head. The second thing I usually do is recommend a methodology for them to follow. And it's usually, if you were to start a new company, write a book, or even get the URL to the thing that represents the thing you want to do the most, what would it be called? What would be the chapter headings for your book? So just 10 chapter headings that would help me understand this thing you want to create that the world needs. And if you've got that little roadmap, it's quite possible that you might be able to fill in those chapters and go forward with that. But you've got to make it real, and you've got to spell it out. And sometimes I recommend the book The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron, which actually is a wonderful way of thinking about creativity and art, and in anything that we do professionally, to follow through on that. So that's usually my first steps and advice on that.
I hear you, Hansen, asking people to take themselves on the edge and making it very concrete, so that the unknown becomes a little bit more tangible and visible, which to me is one of the gifts that you're sharing with us today. And
I think we owe it to ourselves. We're in a moment of transformation. We need to create new ideas and new solutions.
Thank you, Hansen. It's been an absolute honor and privilege and delight to cycle with you for the last 30 minutes. If you are enjoying these podcasts, you can find us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. Also, of course, on LinkedIn and YouTube. This was the Connected Teamwork Podcast. I was speaking with Hansen Hossein, a storyteller on the edge, and an Emmy Award-winning journalist, and many other things in life. I'm your host, Hilko Faber. See you next time at the Connected Teamwork Podcast. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Connected Teamwork Podcast by Growth Leaders Network. Take a moment to reflect on what you learned today that can help build your team. Also, if you like, think about one of your team members and what you appreciate about them. Let them know. Enjoy connecting more deeply to what is great about them. and see you next time at the Connected Teamwork Podcast.